A flight attendant slaps a black teen in first class, accusing him of lying. But from a row behind him, a powerful person stands, who saw everything. Because the boy is no ordinary passenger. He's the grandson of a federal judge. No arrest, no press conference, just one shocking offer. Live with the family she wronged. Why did the judge show mercy? Why did the boy stay silent? What follows is a story of shame, second chances, and a reckoning no one saw coming. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. Gate B12 hummed with activity as travelers rushed past, their rolling suitcases creating a constant rhythm against the polished floor. Overhead, speakers crackled with announcements, mixing with the sounds of crying babies and excited chatter from spring break travelers. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls from nearby kiosks, adding to the sensory overload of the busy morning. 13-year-old Caleb Johnson stood tall near the gate counter, his navy slacks and crisp button-up shirt setting him apart from the casual crowd. His fingers traced the edge of his first-class boarding pass to Charlotte, a prize that felt both thrilling and intimidating. He'd earned this trip by winning the National Belonging Essay competition, and the thought made his heart swell with quiet pride. His essay had beaten out thousands of others, something his teachers had celebrated with a small party in his honor last week. "Let me check one more time," Judge Vivian Lane said, her elegant hand reaching for Caleb's backpack. Despite her 80 years, she moved with the same grace that had commanded federal courtrooms for decades. Her silver hair was swept into a neat bun, and her eyes held the wisdom of years spent fighting for justice. The gold bracelet on her wrist caught the sunlight as she moved, a gift from her late husband that she never traveled without. "Grandmother, I've got everything," Caleb assured her, his voice gentle but firm. "Phone's charged, snacks are packed, and my ticket's right here." He patted his chest pocket, where the boarding pass sat safely tucked away. He'd checked his bag 3 times before leaving home, making lists in his neat handwriting to ensure nothing was forgotten. Judge Lane's eyes softened as she looked at her grandson. "I know you do, baby. You've always been thorough." She straightened his already perfect collar, more for comfort than necessity. "But it's my job to worry, even when you don't need me to." Her fingers lingered momentarily on his shoulder, reluctant to let him go. Around them, families hugged goodbye and business travelers rushed past with coffee cups clutched in their hands. A group of teenagers laughed loudly at a nearby charging station, their spring break excitement filling the air. A small child dropped a stuffed animal and Caleb stooped to retrieve it, handing it back with a kind smile that made the toddler beam. "I want to do this by myself," Caleb said, standing a little straighter. "I know I can." His eyes held a determination that reminded Judge Lane of his father, her son, who had shown that same quiet confidence from an early age. Judge Lane nodded, pride evident in her warm smile. "Of course you can." She pulled him into a firm embrace, her voice dropping to a whisper that was just for him. "You belong in every room, baby. Don't let anyone make you forget that." It was the mantra she'd instilled in him since he was small enough to sit on her knee. Caleb hugged her back tightly, drawing strength from her words. When they separated, his eyes shone with determination and love. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, ready for the adventure ahead. Across the terminal, a different scene was unfolding. Nancy Whitaker trudged toward Gate B12, her navy uniform pristine despite her exhausted demeanor. Her rolling bag squeaked slightly as she pulled it, each step heavy with the weight of her worries. Dark circles lurked under her eyes, partially hidden by carefully applied makeup. She'd been up since 4 a.m., after a night of fitful sleep punctuated by worries about bills and her sick son. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, probably another text from her mother about Tyler's fever. Or worse, another past due notice she couldn't deal with right now. Her ex-husband's missed child support payments were piling up, and the bills weren't going to pay themselves. She ignored the vibration, forcing her features into the professional mask she'd perfected over years of service. The smile didn't reach her eyes, but passengers rarely noticed such details. "Morning, Nancy," the gate agent called out, holding out a manifest list. Light load to Charlotte today, only about 70% full. Carol's cheerful tone grated on Nancy's frayed nerves, though she'd never let it show. Nancy pinned her name tag to her uniform, making sure it sat perfectly straight. "Thanks, Carol," she replied, her voice carrying a cheerfulness she didn't feel. She took the manifest, scanning it quickly as she had thousands of times before. The familiar routine was comforting, one of the few things in her life that remained predictable and orderly. At the gate, Caleb shifted his weight from one polished dress shoe to the other, watching as the first group of passengers began to line up. His fingers found the boarding pass again, drawing comfort from its presence. This was his moment, his achievement, and he was ready. The butterflies in his stomach weren't fear, he decided, but anticipation. Judge Lane stood back, her posture relaxed but alert as she watched her grandson prepare to board. Years of experience had taught her to read rooms, to sense undercurrents, and to stay vigilant even in moments of joy. She'd fought too many battles and won too many victories to ever fully let her guard down. Her gaze swept the gate area, a habit formed during decades of civil rights work when danger could come from any direction. The gate agent's voice rang out clear and professional. "We're now boarding our first-class passengers for Flight 2187 to Charlotte. Please have your boarding passes ready." The announcement set off a flurry of movement as travelers gathered their belongings. Caleb turned to his grandmother one last time, his smile bright and genuine. "I'll call you when I land." He straightened his shoulders, ready to embark on this journey alone. "I know you will," Judge Lane replied, her voice steady and warm. She watched as he joined the line, presenting his boarding pass with the same dignity she'd seen him show in every situation, big or small. Even at 13, he carried himself with a poise that many adults never achieved. Nancy entered the plane through the crew entrance, her professional smile already in place despite the exhaustion that seemed to seep into her bones. She stowed her bag in the crew area, going through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical efficiency. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform sleeves, a ritual that helped her transition fully into her flight attendant persona. Through the terminal window, Judge Lane watched as Caleb disappeared down the jet bridge, his head held high. She remained still, a picture of composure, even as her grandson vanished from view. Her hands clasped loosely in front of her, she stood sentinel-like, her presence commanding respect without demanding it. Several passers-by glanced at her twice, recognizing something special in her dignified bearing. Inside the jet bridge, Caleb took measured steps forward, his heart beating a little faster with each move toward the aircraft. Behind him, other passengers chatted and shuffled, but he remained focused on his path forward, just as his grandmother had taught him. He rehearsed his introduction to the flight attendants in his mind, wanting to make a good impression. Nancy moved through the first-class cabin, checking overhead bins and seatbelt positions, her movements precise and practiced. She hadn't yet noticed the young passenger about to board, her mind still caught in the web of her personal struggles. She straightened a safety card in the seat pocket, her thoughts miles away with her feverish son. The morning sun continued to pour through the terminal windows, casting long rays across the gate area where Judge Lane stood watching, her expression serene but watchful. The airport buzzed around her, a constant flow of humanity rushing to and fro, but she remained still, a calm center in the midst of chaos. She would wait until the plane taxied away, sending her silent strength with her grandson as he ventured into the world alone. The first-class cabin of the Atlanta to Charlotte flight gleamed with subtle luxury. Soft beige leather seats stretched across the front rows, their wide armrests and ample legroom a stark contrast to the cramped quarters behind. The overhead bins closed with gentle thuds as early boarding passengers settled in, the sound mingling with the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Caleb Johnson slipped into seat 3A, his movements careful and deliberate. The leather seat felt cool against his back, and he ran his hand along the smooth armrest, still processing that this space was meant for him. Through the window, he could see the ground crew moving efficiently across the tarmac, their orange vests bright against the gray concrete as they loaded luggage and prepared the aircraft for departure. His backpack tucked neatly under the seat in front of him, Caleb took a deep breath. The cabin air carried a hint of coffee from the galley, and the quiet murmur of conversation felt different here, more subdued, more controlled, like whispers in a library. He pulled out his phone to text his grandmother that he was seated safely, just as she'd asked, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen. The sound of heels clicking on the cabin floor drew closer, sharp and purposeful. Nancy Whitaker emerged from the galley, her navy uniform pressed despite her exhaustion, her name tag catching the overhead lights as she moved. She began her practiced routine of greeting passengers and checking carry-on placement, her smile not quite reaching her tired eyes, but her steps faltered when she noticed Caleb. Her eyes narrowed, scanning him from his polished dress shoes to his carefully combed hair, taking in every detail of his appearance. The corners of her mouth tightened into what might have been trying to pass for a smile but failed miserably. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness that felt like honey laced with vinegar. "Coach is in the back." Caleb looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'm in 3A, ma'am," he replied, his voice clear but respectful, just as his grandmother had taught him through countless dinner conversations about dignity and self-worth. Nancy's frown deepened, creating harsh lines around her mouth that aged her instantly. "Let me see your ticket," she demanded, holding out her hand with an impatient flutter of her fingers, as if shooing away an insect. Without hesitation, Caleb retrieved his boarding pass and handed it to her. The paper was slightly curved from being held so carefully during his wait at the gate, the printed letters crisp and unmistakable. Nancy barely glanced at it before shaking her head, her lips pursing with disapproval. "This can't be right," she muttered, more to herself than to Caleb. Her eyes darted between the ticket and the boy sitting in the premium seat, disbelief etched across her features. "There must be some mistake. Someone must have upgraded you." Her thoughts raced. "This isn't protocol. This doesn't make sense. Why would he be in first class? Children don't belong here, especially not—" The passenger in 3C lowered his newspaper slightly, watching the interaction over his reading glasses, his bushy eyebrows furrowing with interest. Across the aisle, a woman in 3D set down her phone, her attention caught by the rising tension, her manicured fingers tapping nervously on her armrest. "My grandmother booked the flight," Caleb began to explain, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach that twisted tighter with each passing second. "I won a contest." "Don't interrupt," Nancy cut him off, her voice rising like a teacher scolding a disobedient student. Other passengers turned their heads now, the quiet atmosphere of first class disturbed by her sharp tone. "Where did you really get this ticket?" Caleb's hands clasped together in his lap, knuckles whitening slightly, but his posture remained straight, backbone rigid with dignity. "My grandmother—" He tried again, determined to explain. "Don't lie to me," Nancy snapped, her voice echoing in the cabin like a slap. The fatigue of back-to-back flights, the stress of unpaid bills piling up at home, and her own unexamined biases merged into a storm of hostility directed at the young boy before her, a perfect target for her accumulated frustrations. More passengers were turning now, their conversations dying mid-sentence. A man in 2D had his phone partially raised, its camera lens catching the light as he discreetly began recording. The woman in 3D had her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, though it wasn't clear whether it was directed at Nancy or Caleb, her eyes darting between them. Caleb took another breath, fighting to keep his voice from shaking, to maintain the composure his grandmother had modeled for him his entire life. "Ma'am, I can explain. The ticket is mine. I won the National Belonging Essay Competition, and this flight was part of the prize. My grandmother, Judge Lane, she helped me." "I don't need to hear about any grandmother or contest," Nancy interrupted again, her voice growing louder with each word, drowning out his explanation before it could fully form. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the boarding pass, creating small creases in the paper that seemed to mirror the lines of tension across her face. "This is a first-class cabin, and there are protocols we need to follow." The tension in the cabin was palpable now, thick enough to touch. More phones appeared in passengers' hands, their cameras ready to record whatever might happen next, sensing a viral moment in the making. The soft luxury of the first-class cabin felt stretched thin, like a bubble about to burst under too much pressure. Caleb sat perfectly still, his grandmother's words echoing in his mind. "You belong in every room." But Nancy's fierce glare and accusatory tone made those words feel distant, challenged by the harsh reality of the moment unfolding around him. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his voice remained respectful as he tried one more time to explain, clinging to the dignity his grandmother had instilled in him. "Please, ma'am, if you'll just check the manifest—" Nancy's face flushed red, her composure cracking completely like thin ice under too much weight. "I know exactly what's on my manifest," she said, her voice rising to a near shout, each word sharp and brittle. The other passengers watched in growing discomfort as the scene unfolded, their phones capturing every moment of the confrontation, witnesses to an injustice they hadn't expected to encounter at 30,000 feet. The tension in the first-class cabin crackled like static electricity. Caleb's cheek burned where his grandmother's goodbye kiss had landed just minutes ago, and his heart thundered against his ribs. He gripped the armrests of seat 3A, knuckles white against the soft beige leather, willing himself to stay calm despite Nancy's looming presence. The smell of recycled air and expensive cologne filled his nostrils as he tried to steady his breathing. "I have every right to be here," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. The words came out clear and measured, just like his grandmother had taught him, always dignified, even when others weren't. He straightened his shoulders, feeling the crisp fabric of his button-down shirt against his skin. Nancy's face contorted, her professional mask cracking to reveal something raw and ugly underneath. The overhead lights caught the sheen of sweat on her forehead, and her name tag tilted crookedly on her navy uniform. Her lips pressed into a thin white line as she towered over him. "Don't you dare take that tone with me," she snapped, her voice rising sharp enough to cut through the usual airplane white noise. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I know when something isn't right." Her fingers twitched at her sides, clenching and unclenching as if searching for something to hold on to. In seat 2C, a businessman in a charcoal suit slowly lowered his Wall Street Journal, his eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding before him. A gold watch glinted on his wrist as he shifted uncomfortably. Across the aisle in 2A, a teenage girl with carefully straightened hair pretended to check her phone while actually recording, her screen partially hidden by her lowered tray table. Her eyes darted nervously between Caleb and Nancy. Caleb's chest tightened. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some concerned, others merely curious, a few deliberately looking away. The air felt thick with unspoken words and building pressure. His boarding pass lay on his lap, the printed seat number clearly visible, 3A. "Ma'am, I'm not lying," Caleb said, forcing himself to meet Nancy's gaze. "This is my seat." He tapped the boarding pass gently with his index finger, the paper crinkling under his touch. The words had barely left his mouth when it happened. Nancy's hand shot out, fast as a striking snake, and connected with Caleb's cheek. The sharp crack of skin meeting skin echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, cutting through the hum of the idling engines. Time seemed to stop. Caleb's head rocked to the side more from shock than force. His ear rang, and heat bloomed across his face. He tasted metal, realized he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. The sting spread across his skin like wildfire. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Phones appeared from nowhere, their camera lenses glinting like eager eyes. The businessman in 2C half rose from his seat, mouth open in protest. The teenage girl in 2A had both hands pressed to her mouth, her phone now recording openly on her tray. A child somewhere behind them began to cry softly. In that frozen moment, Caleb didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, one hand pressed to his cheek, staring straight ahead as his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "You belong in every room." The memory of her voice steadied him, a lighthouse in the storm of humiliation washing over him. Then came the sound, sharp heels clicking on the airplane's floor, steady and purposeful. The sound grew closer, and heads turned toward the back of first class. Judge Vivian Lane emerged from the shadows of the cabin, her gray pantsuit pristine, her silver hair crowned with dignity. Her face was calm, but her eyes blazed with controlled fury as they locked onto Nancy. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. "You just struck the grandson of a federal judge." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Judge Lane's voice carried the weight of decades on the bench, of countless decisions that had changed lives. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each syllable landed with the precision of a gavel striking wood. Nancy's hand, the one she'd used to strike Caleb, began to tremble. The color drained from her face, leaving her makeup stark against her skin. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The airline pin on her lapel caught the light, a cruel reminder of the authority she had just abused. Judge Lane turned to Caleb, her voice softening. "Get your bag." The gentleness in her tone was a stark contrast to the steel that had been there seconds before. Caleb moved without hesitation, reaching under the seat for his backpack. His movements were mechanical, precise, as if operating on autopilot. He stood, the leather seat creaking slightly as he rose. His legs felt wooden beneath him, but he forced them to move. Together, grandmother and grandson walked past Nancy, who remained frozen in place like a statue carved from ice. The other passengers in first class pressed themselves against their seats, creating a path through the aisle. Phone cameras continued to record, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The quiet click of shutters and soft murmurs provided an unsettling soundtrack. Judge Lane's hand rested lightly on Caleb's shoulder as they moved, a gesture both protective and proud. Caleb walked with his head high, though his cheek still burned with the imprint of Nancy's hand. The click of Judge Lane's heels and the soft shuffle of Caleb's dress shoes were the only sounds in the cabin. His heart still raced, but the weight of his grandmother's presence beside him made breathing easier. Behind them, Nancy remained rooted to the spot, her uniform suddenly seeming too tight, too confining. Her world, already precarious, had just shattered completely. The phones kept recording, their lenses capturing the exact moment when actions met consequences, when bias met justice, when wrong met right. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. The air in the cabin felt electric with unspoken words and the weight of what had just transpired. Every passenger knew they had witnessed something significant, not just a confrontation, but a moment that would ripple far beyond this flight, this airport, this day. In the quiet aftermath, the only sound was the steady hum of the engines, indifferent to the human drama playing out within their metal cocoon. The jet bridge felt like a long tunnel stretching before Caleb and Judge Lane as they made their slow journey back to the terminal. Their footsteps echoed hollowly against the metal walkway, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere they'd left behind in the airplane cabin. The cool air wrapped around them like a protective blanket, giving Caleb's stinging cheek some relief. With each step, the reality of what had just happened settled deeper into his bones. Judge Lane walked beside her grandson with measured steps, her face a masterpiece of controlled composure. But her hand rested protectively on Caleb's shoulder, steady and warm. Occasionally, her fingers would give him a gentle squeeze, a silent reminder that she was there, that he wasn't alone. Caleb clutched his backpack against his chest like a shield, his eyes shining with unshed tears he refused to let fall. The essay certificate that had earned him this trip was still tucked safely inside. At the gate, 2 agents looked up in confusion as the pair emerged. One stepped forward, her name tag reading, Sarah, concern etched across her features. "Is everything all right?" she asked, glancing between them, noting the red mark on Caleb's face. Judge Lane's voice carried the weight of decades on the federal bench. "No, everything is not all right. I need to speak with your supervisor immediately, and TSA." Her words were calm, but carried an unmistakable authority that demanded action. The gate agent's eyes widened at the mention of TSA. She grabbed her phone, fingers flying across the keypad. Within minutes, the quiet gate area transformed into a hub of activity. Passengers waiting for connecting flights watched with curious expressions. A TSA officer in his dark uniform arrived first, walking with purpose, followed closely by a man in a crisp airline management suit who seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. "I'm Gerald Matthews, Terminal B supervisor," the suited man said, extending his hand. "We understand there's been an incident?" His practiced smile couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. Judge Lane's voice remained steady as steel. "Your flight attendant, Nancy Whitaker, just physically assaulted my 13-year-old grandson in first class. I am retired federal judge Vivian Lane, and I witnessed the entire exchange." She kept her hand on Caleb's shoulder, a gesture both protective and grounding. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The supervisor's professional smile vanished, replaced by genuine alarm. He gestured toward a nearby doorway. "Please, Your Honor, let's discuss this somewhere private." His eyes darted nervously to the gathering onlookers. In a quiet office just off the main terminal, Judge Lane recounted the events with precise detail: Nancy's initial confrontation, her escalating behavior, and the shocking moment of violence. Caleb sat beside his grandmother, his posture straight despite his trembling hands. He stared at a point on the wall, trying to make himself invisible while still holding on to his dignity. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Nancy found herself being escorted off by 2 airline officials. Her face had lost all color, and her hands shook as she gathered her belongings from the galley. The reality of her actions was beginning to sink in, bringing with it waves of panic. Passengers watched through the cabin, phones still recording as she was led away. Some whispered to each other, others shook their heads in disgust. They took her to a small holding room with gray walls and fluorescent lighting. A table, 4 chairs, and a window showing the tarmac were the only features. Nancy sank into one of the chairs, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight around her neck. Her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Her supervisor entered first, followed by someone from legal. Their faces were grim, their movements deliberate and professional. "Ms. Whitaker," the legal representative began, "we need your account of what happened on Flight 2187. He clicked his pen, ready to document her version of events. Nancy's words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "There was a miscommunication. I was tired. Back-to-back flights, you know how it is. The boy, he didn't look like he belonged in first class. I thought he might have sneaked up from coach." Even to her own ears, the explanation sounded hollow. "So you struck him?" her supervisor asked flatly, disbelief evident in his tone. "I didn't mean to," Nancy's voice cracked. "He was being disrespectful. I lost control for a second." She ran her fingers through her hair, disheveling her once perfect appearance. The legal representative's pen scratched against his notepad. "Ms. Whitaker, are you aware that several passengers recorded the entire interaction?" His voice was carefully neutral, but his implication was clear. Nancy's face crumpled. "He was lying about his ticket." "He was not," her supervisor cut in. "That boy won his first-class seat through a national essay competition. His grandmother is a federal judge who witnessed everything, and now videos of you assaulting a minor are already appearing online." He slid his phone across the table, showing a social media page where the incident was gaining traction. Nancy's defiance crumbled. She stared at her hands, which had stopped shaking but felt foreign to her now, especially the one that had struck Caleb. The weight of what she'd done pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In a quiet executive lounge across the terminal, Judge Lane sat close to Caleb on a plush sofa. She held his hand, her thumb moving in small, comforting circles across his knuckles. Around them, airline staff moved with urgent purpose, making calls and typing rapidly on laptops as the incident began spreading across social media. Outside the window, planes took off and landed in a rhythm that felt disconnected from the turmoil inside. "This world will keep trying to make you feel small, baby," Judge Lane said softly, her voice carrying years of hard-won wisdom. "But I'll remind them exactly who you are." She tilted his chin up gently, making him meet her eyes. "And who you are is extraordinary." In the holding room, Nancy sat alone, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across her face. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, seeing herself clearly for the first time that day. Not just the uniform and perfect makeup, but the anger and prejudice that had led to this moment. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. She knew, with crushing certainty, that whatever came next would be worse than simply losing her job. The door opened slowly, revealing faces that would decide her fate. The executive conference room hummed with nervous energy. Late afternoon sun slanted through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the sleek glass table where Judge Vivian Lane sat, the very picture of composure. Her silver hair caught the light, creating a subtle halo effect that only added to her commanding presence. She hadn't touched the water glass placed before her, maintaining perfect stillness while everyone around her fidgeted. Beside her, Caleb remained quiet, his hands folded in his lap. The red mark on his cheek had faded, but the memory of the strike lingered in everyone's minds. He kept his eyes down, focusing on the smooth surface of the table rather than the row of anxious faces across from them. His fingers occasionally traced invisible patterns on his knee, the only sign of his inner turmoil. 3 airline representatives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Thomas Bradford, the senior executive, dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, the silk square becoming increasingly damp. Sarah Chen, the legal advisor, shuffled through papers without really reading them, her manicured nails clicking against the documents. Marcus Rodriguez, head of PR, couldn't stop checking his phone as social media notifications kept buzzing, each one making him wince. "The video has over 50,000 views already," Marcus said, his voice tight. "We're tracking multiple uploads across different platforms. It's trending in 3 major cities." Judge Lane didn't react to this information. She simply sat, hands clasped on the table, watching them squirm. The silence stretched until Thomas couldn't take it anymore, the ticking of the wall clock seeming to grow louder with each passing second. "Judge Lane," he began, clearing his throat, "we want to express our deepest regrets about this incident. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation and—" "Mr. Bradford," Judge Lane interrupted, her voice smooth as silk but sharp as steel, "I'm not interested in your money." The 3 representatives exchanged confused glances, a silent conversation of raised eyebrows and widened eyes. Sarah Chen leaned forward, her professional smile strained at the edges. "With all due respect, Your Honor, given the severity of the incident and the clear liability issues—" "What happened today?" Judge Lane continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Wasn't just about my grandson. It's about a deeper problem that money won't fix." She paused, looking each of them in the eye, her gaze unflinching and penetrating. "I have a different proposition." A knock at the door interrupted her. A security officer led Nancy Whitaker into the room. Nancy looked like she'd aged years in the past few hours. Her uniform was wrinkled, her face pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she took the seat indicated at the far end of the table. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone expecting the worst. "Ms. Whitaker," Judge Lane acknowledged her presence without warmth. "I was just explaining to your employers that I'm not interested in pressing charges or seeking financial compensation." Nancy's shoulders sagged with visible relief, but Judge Lane wasn't finished. Her next words landed like stones in still water. "Instead, you're going to come live with my family for 1 week." The room went completely still. Nancy's mouth fell open. "You want me to what?" "Shadow me, meet my family, face the people you hurt." Judge Lane's voice remained steady, each word measured and deliberate. "Learn something about the world you clearly don't understand." "That's—" Nancy struggled to find words, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's ridiculous. You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious." Judge Lane's gaze never wavered. "You have a choice, Ms. Whitaker. Accept this arrangement, or we can pursue this incident through more traditional channels. I'm sure your union representative has already explained the likely outcomes there." Nancy's face drained of what little color remained. She looked desperately at her employers, but they were already nodding enthusiastically, relief washing over their features. This is very generous," Thomas Bradford said quickly, practically stumbling over his words. "A wonderful opportunity for cultural exchange and personal growth." "It's not generosity," Judge Lane corrected him. "It's accountability." Sarah Chen was already pulling documents from her briefcase, the metallic snap of clasps echoing in the tense room. "We can draw up the necessary agreements immediately. Of course, Ms. Whitaker's position will be protected during this learning experience." Nancy sat frozen, her world tilting on its axis. "I have a son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't just leave." "Your son can stay with his father or grandmother for the week," Judge Lane said. "I've already checked your personnel file. You have no scheduled flights for the next 10 days. Caleb finally looked up, studying Nancy's face. She caught his eye for a moment before quickly looking away, shame coloring her cheeks. Something unspoken passed between them. A question from him, perhaps, and no answer from her. Marcus Rodriguez was typing rapidly on his phone. "This is perfect," he muttered, a hint of excitement breaking through his professional demeanor. "We can frame it as a voluntary diversity and inclusion initiative. You will not be using this for publicity." Judge Lane's voice cut through his planning like a knife. "This stays private." The PR director deflated visibly but nodded, tucking his phone away with reluctant fingers. Sarah Chen slid papers across the table to Nancy. "Standard confidentiality agreements, plus the specific terms Judge Lane has outlined. Your job and benefits will be fully protected, contingent on your successful completion of this arrangement." Nancy stared at the documents, her hand shaking as she picked up the pen. She looked like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing they had to jump. The pen hovered over the signature line as she took a deep breath. "1 week?" she asked quietly, her voice small in the large room. "1 week," Judge Lane confirmed. "Starting tomorrow." Nancy signed her name, the scratch of pen on paper loud in the quiet room. Judge Lane stood, her movement causing everyone else to scramble to their feet, chairs scraping against the floor. "You have a room waiting for you in Birmingham," she said, looking down at Nancy. "I suggest you pack light." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Nancy's face as she sat there, looking at her signature on the paper that had just changed everything. Outside the windows, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that inside this room lives were being dramatically altered. The morning air was crisp and sharp as Nancy walked through the sliding doors of Atlanta's airport. Her civilian clothes felt strange after years of wearing her crisp flight attendant uniform. The soft fabric of her hoodie offered little comfort as she clutched her backpack closer, trying to make herself smaller, almost invisible among the crowd. The terminal was starting to fill with early morning travelers. Business people clutched coffee cups, families herded sleepy children, all moving with purpose. Nancy checked her phone again. 6:15 a.m. Her flight to Birmingham would board in less than an hour. Another missed call notification flashed on her screen, her mother's name glowing accusingly. She swiped it away, guilt churning in her stomach like sour milk. Tyler was still sick at home, coughing and feverish, and she hadn't properly explained to either of them why she had to leave so suddenly. How could she explain this? The shame of yesterday's events pressed down on her like a physical weight, bending her shoulders forward. The first-class boarding pass in her hand felt like a cruel joke, the same luxury seating she had tried to deny Caleb. Her fingers trembled slightly as she made her way through security, fumbling with her shoes and belt at the scanner. The walk to her gate felt endless, a gauntlet of imagined accusations. Every face she passed seemed to be staring, judging, knowing. She kept her head down, but couldn't shake the feeling that everyone had seen the video, that everyone knew what she had done. Each glance in her direction felt like another indictment. The flight itself was mercifully short, but each minute stretched like an hour. Nancy chose a window seat and pressed herself against it, avoiding all eye contact with her fellow passengers. The flight attendant's practiced cheerfulness made her wince. Had she sounded that false, that condescending to passengers all these years? The thought made her stomach turn with self-loathing. As the plane descended into Birmingham, the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. This wasn't just a week of observation. This was judgment. Penance. Her hands were cold and clammy as she deplaned, her mouth dry with anxiety. A tall man in a dark suit stood waiting at baggage claim, holding a simple sign with N. Whitaker printed in clean letters. His expression revealed nothing. He nodded once, professionally distant, and led her to a polished black town car waiting at the curb. The drive was silent except for the soft classical music playing through the speakers. Bach, she thought, though she couldn't be sure. Birmingham's streets gave way to older neighborhoods with sprawling oak trees and historic homes that spoke of old money and quiet influence. They pulled up to a stately red brick house that seemed to radiate dignity from every carefully maintained inch. The manicured lawn stretched out front, and 2 flags caught the morning breeze. The American flag, and beside it, a cream-colored banner declaring, "Vote with Dignity," in bold letters that seemed to challenge her directly. Nancy's footsteps echoed on the porch steps, each one announcing her unwelcome arrival. Inside, the house opened into a foyer that told its own story of history and purpose. The walls were lined with framed newspaper headlines, yellowed with age but carefully preserved behind glass. "Federal judge rules in landmark case," one proclaimed. "Lane takes stand for justice," declared another. Each one a testament to a life of purpose. Photographs tracked decades of service. Judge Lane on courthouse steps with determination etched in her face. Judge Lane linking arms with civil rights leaders during marches. Judge Lane shaking hands with 3 different presidents in the Oval Office. The weight of legacy pressed in from every direction, making Nancy feel smaller with each step, more insignificant in the face of such accomplishment. A housekeeper appeared silently and led Nancy upstairs to a guest room. The space was immaculate, cream walls, pressed linens, polished furniture that gleamed in the morning light. Everything was perfectly arranged, but there was an intentional sterility to it. No warm touches, no welcoming flourishes, no fresh flowers or decorative pillows. This wasn't meant to be comfortable. This was meant to be examined, like Nancy herself. As Nancy set her bag down, movement in the hallway caught her eye. Caleb stood there, frozen mid-step, school books clutched to his chest. Their eyes met for a brief electric moment. The mark she'd left on his cheek was gone, but the memory flashed between them like lightning. Caleb's face remained carefully blank as he looked away and continued down the hall, his footsteps measured and deliberate, refusing to hurry past her. Judge Lane appeared in the doorway, her presence filling the room without effort. Her silver hair framed a face that had seen decades of injustice and fought against it all. Her voice was cool and precise as she laid out the rules. "You will eat with us, you will listen. You will not speak unless asked. This is not a vacation, Ms. Whitaker." Each word landed like a gavel strike. Nancy nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice betraying her fear. Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Nancy stared at the ceiling fan slowly rotating above her. Outside, crickets chirped their endless song. Inside, her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The enormity of where she was in this house, in this situation, in this mess of her own making, pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She thought of Tyler at home with her mother, probably wondering why she'd left so suddenly with only a hurried explanation. She thought of Caleb's face in the hallway, of the careful blankness that must have taken effort to maintain. She thought of Judge Lane's carefully preserved history on the walls downstairs, decades of fighting for justice. She thought of her own face in that viral video, twisted with an anger she barely recognized, a stranger wearing her features. The crickets kept chirping. Nancy kept staring at the ceiling. Sleep felt very far away, like redemption itself. The formal dining room gleamed with old money and deeper history. Crystal glasses caught the early evening light, casting prism patterns across a mahogany table that could seat 12, but was set for 4. The china was delicate, with hand-painted blue flowers around the edges that whispered stories of generations past. Everything spoke of tradition, dignity, and carefully preserved memories. A living museum of family legacy that made Nancy feel like an intruder before she'd even stepped fully inside. Nancy hesitated in the doorway, feeling awkward in her khakis and navy blazer, an outfit that had seemed appropriate when she packed but now felt stiff and trying too hard. She tugged at her collar nervously, wishing she'd chosen something else. The others were already seated. Judge Lane at the head of the table, radiating quiet authority without saying a word. Caleb, small and withdrawn in his chair, eyes fixed on his empty plate, and a woman Nancy hadn't met yet but recognized instantly as Caleb's mother. Denise Johnson carried herself with the same grace as Judge Lane, but there was something sharper in her careful composure, a protective edge that Nancy could feel from across the room. Her dark eyes tracked Nancy's entrance without warmth or welcome, measuring every step. She wore a simple but elegant black dress that made Nancy's business casual ensemble feel even more out of place, like a costume that didn't quite fit. "Please sit," Judge Lane gestured to the empty chair across from Caleb. Nancy lowered herself carefully, hyper-aware of every movement, as if one wrong move might shatter the delicate atmosphere. The chair legs scraped slightly against the hardwood floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room, making her wince. Judge Lane folded her hands and bowed her head. The others followed suit, leaving Nancy to quickly duck her head as well, feeling like she'd missed a cue in a play everyone else had rehearsed. "Lord, we thank you for this food and the hands that prepared it. Guide us toward understanding and truth. Amen." The prayer was brief, but its ending brought no relief to the thick tension that hung in the air like summer humidity. Only the soft clink of silverware broke the silence as they began to eat. The food was expertly prepared: roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, homemade rolls with a golden crust. But Nancy could barely taste it. Her throat felt too tight to swallow properly, each bite requiring conscious effort. Unable to bear the weight of silence any longer, Nancy cleared her throat. "The house is beautiful. So much history here." Her voice sounded unnaturally bright, even to her own ears. No one responded. Denise buttered a roll with precise movements, her focus deliberate. Caleb pushed green beans around his plate, creating little patterns that he didn't eat. Judge Lane took a measured sip of water, her eyes watching Nancy over the rim of her glass. Nancy tried again, desperation creeping into her tone. The weather was nice for the flight in. Clear skies, no turbulence. Still nothing. The silence pressed in harder, making her ears ring with its intensity. Desperate to fill the void and unconsciously reaching for something, anything, to establish common ground, Nancy made a fatal mistake. "Kids today," she began, attempting a conspiratorial tone. "Sometimes they seem so entitled, like everything should be handed to them." The words hung in the air like poison, impossible to take back once released. Denise's knife stopped mid-motion. She placed it deliberately beside her plate and raised her eyes to meet Nancy's. Her voice was controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface that could have cut glass. "Oh, I see. So when a 13-year-old black boy earns something through hard work, he's entitled? Is that what you're suggesting?" Nancy felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her lightheaded. I wasn't talking about race." The words sounded hollow even as she spoke them. "Then what were you talking about?" Judge Lane's quiet question cut through the air like a blade, precise and unavoidable. Nancy's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The tick of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed deafening, marking each second of her failure to respond. Forks clinked against china in the horrible silence, the sound almost musical in its cruelty. Caleb's chair scraped back. He stood without looking at anyone, shoulders tight with contained emotion that seemed too heavy for his young frame. "May I be excused?" he asked softly, his voice steady despite everything. Judge Lane nodded and Caleb walked out of the dining room, his steps measured and careful until they couldn't hear them anymore. The empty doorway seemed to accuse Nancy with its emptiness. Nancy stared at her plate, shame burning hot across her face and neck. She heard rather than saw Judge Lane place her napkin on the table and rise with the quiet dignity that seemed to define her. "You'll sleep better if you start listening." The words fell heavy as judgment, final as a gavel. Nancy remained frozen in her chair, alone at the grand table, surrounded by the weight of all she had failed to understand and the consequences of words she couldn't take back. The only sound was the steady tick of the grandfather clock, counting out moments of uncomfortable truth that stretched toward a long night of reckoning. The hallway was dark except for thin strips of moonlight filtering through the windows. Nancy padded quietly toward her room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floors. The house creaked with age and history, sounds that made her feel even more like an intruder in this space that held generations of memories that weren't hers. She paused outside her door, hand on the knob when she heard it. Soft voices drifting from Caleb's room down the hall. Her breath caught in her throat. She shouldn't listen. She knew she shouldn't. But her feet moved of their own accord, drawing her closer to the partially open door, as if pulled by an invisible thread. "I tried so hard, Grandma." Caleb's voice was thick with unshed tears, the kind that burn at the back of your throat. "I wore my best clothes. I said yes, ma'am, and please and thank you. I did everything right." Nancy's chest tightened painfully. She pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself, feeling the cool texture of the plaster beneath her fingertips. "I know you did, baby." Judge Lane's voice was gentle but firm, wrapped in the warmth of unconditional love. "You always do." "She looked at me like I was trash, Grandma." His words came out in a broken whisper that made Nancy's eyes burn and her stomach twist with shame. Like I didn't matter. Like I wasn't even human. There was a pause, and Nancy could picture Judge Lane sitting on the edge of Caleb's bed, her presence both comfort and strength, a lighthouse in the darkness of his hurt. "You do matter," Judge Lane said simply, with the quiet certainty of absolute truth. "And that's why she's here." Nancy backed away from the door, her hand pressed against her mouth to hold back a sound that might betray her presence. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears. She turned and fled down the stairs, through the kitchen and out onto the back porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. The night air was cool against her flushed face, a gentle relief from the suffocating weight of what she'd heard. She sank into one of the wooden rocking chairs, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. The screen glowed in the darkness as she opened her photo gallery, illuminating her tear-streaked face with its blue light. There was Eli at his last birthday party, 11 candles blazing on the cake, each flame reflecting in his bright eyes. His smile was wide, gap-toothed, innocent, untouched by what was to come. She swiped left, Eli at his piano recital, small fingers poised over the keys, wearing the blue bow tie she'd helped him tie just minutes before he performed Beethoven's Für Elise. Another swipe, the two of them at the beach, building elaborate sandcastles with moats and towers. His dark hair was tousled by the wind, cheeks pink from the sun, freckles standing out against his tan. The last photo made her pause, her finger hovering over the screen. It was taken just 3 days before everything changed forever. Eli was sprawled on the couch, reading a comic book, one sock on and one off, completely absorbed in his superhero world. She'd teased him about it. He'd stuck his tongue out at her, eyes crinkling with laughter. She'd never imagined it would be one of the last moments she'd have with him, an ordinary slice of life that would become precious beyond measure. "I wasn't ready to lose you," she whispered into the darkness, the words barely audible even to herself. Her voice cracked like thin ice. "And I hated every kid who got to live after you didn't." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. All those years of watching other mothers with their children, seeing boys Eli's age growing up, becoming teenagers, having futures her son would never have. The bitterness had grown like poison ivy, wrapping around her heart until she could barely breathe through it, choking out any compassion that tried to take root. And today she'd looked at Caleb, bright, polite, accomplished Caleb, and seen only another reminder of what she'd lost. She'd taken her pain out on an innocent child who'd done nothing wrong except exist in a world where her son no longer did. The realization made her feel hollow and sick. The stars blurred above her as tears filled her eyes, turning the pinpoints of light into streaks of silver. She clutched her phone to her chest, Eli's smiling face still glowing on the screen. For the first time since his funeral, she let herself really feel the weight of her grief. It crashed over her in waves. The memories, the guilt, the anger, the devastating loneliness of outliving her child. Each memory was both treasure and torture. The wooden chair creaked softly as she rocked, tears rolling silently down her cheeks and dripping onto her nightgown. The night breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms from the ancient tree in the side yard. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called into the darkness, its haunting cry echoing her own sorrow. Nancy stayed there long after midnight, crying for her son, for Caleb, for the person she'd become in her pain. Her phone screen had long since gone dark, but she held it close, as if she could somehow hold on to the memory of Eli's smile, his laugh, the way he'd felt in her arms when he was small enough to carry. The tears came quietly now, steady and cleansing as the weight of everything she'd buried began to surface under the vast Alabama sky, studded with stars that had witnessed countless human sorrows and still kept their silent watch. The morning sunlight crept through the lace curtains of the guest room, casting delicate shadows on the hardwood floor. Nancy sat perched on the edge of the bed, still in her pajamas, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind like a movie she couldn't stop. Caleb's voice breaking, her own tears on the back porch, the weight of memories she'd tried so hard to bury. Each replay brought fresh waves of shame washing over her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened slowly, and Judge Lane entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Her presence filled the room with quiet authority, but there was something gentler in her expression this morning, a softness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She handed 1 mug to Nancy and settled into the antique chair across from the bed, the wood creaking slightly under her weight. The coffee's rich aroma filled the space between them. Nancy wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, grateful for something to hold on to, something real and solid when everything else felt like it was crumbling. The silence stretched out, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken words and shared understanding. "His name was Eli," Nancy finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals toward the ceiling. "He was 13. The words felt both familiar and foreign on her tongue, like a prayer she'd recited 1,000 times but never shared. Judge Lane didn't speak. She simply sat, present and attentive, her eyes never leaving Nancy's face as Nancy found her way through the words that had been locked inside for too long. "2 years ago, I came home from a flight." Nancy's voice caught. She took a shaky breath, willing herself to continue. "He was in his room. I thought he was sleeping." The coffee trembled in her hands, mirroring the tremor in her voice. "The paramedics said it was fentanyl. Just 1 pill. 1 stupid pill at a party with kids he wanted to impress." Tears fell into her coffee, creating perfect circles that rippled outward like the consequences of that single moment. "I'm a mother. I'm supposed to know these things. I'm supposed to see when my child is hurting, when he's in trouble. But I didn't see anything. I was always working, always tired, always—" She set the mug down before she could spill it, her hands no longer trustworthy. "He died alone in his room while I was serving drinks at 30,000 feet to strangers who didn't matter." Judge Lane's face remained composed, but her eyes held deep understanding, perhaps even recognition. She waited patiently as Nancy wiped her face with shaking hands, offering the dignity of space. "Yesterday, when I saw Caleb in that seat," Nancy's voice cracked like thin ice. "He was so confident, so sure of himself, the same age as Eli. And something just broke inside me. I saw this healthy, happy 13-year-old boy, and all I could think was, why does he get to live when my son is gone? What makes him special? What makes him deserving?" The confession hung in the air between them, ugly and honest. Nancy pressed her hands to her face, shame and grief washing over her in waves that threatened to pull her under. "I know it's wrong. I know it's terrible. But in that moment, I hated him for being alive when Eli isn't." Judge Lane set her coffee down carefully on the small side table. When she spoke, her voice was measured but firm, like a hand reaching into troubled waters. "Grief is a powerful force, Nancy. It can twist us into shapes we don't recognize. It can make monsters of good people. But it doesn't excuse what happened on that plane." "I know," Nancy whispered, the words barely audible. Understanding why we cause harm is important, Judge Lane continued. But it doesn't erase the harm itself. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. That boy you struck? He's not your son. He's not a symbol of what you lost. He's Caleb, a child who did everything right and still got hurt because of someone else's pain. Nancy nodded, tears flowing freely now, carving warm paths down her cheeks. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can. You start by seeing him, Judge Lane said simply. Really seeing him. Not as a reflection of your grief, but as who he is. She stood, gathering her empty coffee mug with practiced grace. At the door, she paused and looked back at Nancy, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. He's not Eli. He's Caleb. And he still needs protecting, just like your son once did. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Nancy alone with her coffee gone cold and her heart cracked wide open to a pain she'd been running from for 2 long years. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the granite countertops. Nancy hesitated in the doorway, watching as Denise Johnson stood at the coffee maker, her posture straight and composed. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and toast, comfortable and ordinary despite the tension in the air. A gentle hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between them, making the moment stretch uncomfortably. Good morning, Nancy said softly, stepping into the room. Her slippers made a quiet shuffling sound against the tile floor. Denise turned, her face neutral but controlled. Good morning? She didn't smile, but her tone wasn't unkind, just distant, like speaking to a stranger at a bus stop. She moved aside, gesturing to the coffee maker. Help yourself if you'd like some. Her fingers tapped lightly against her own mug, a small, nervous habit that betrayed her otherwise perfect composure. Nancy nodded, grateful for the simple courtesy. As she reached for a mug from the cabinet, footsteps approached from the hallway. Caleb appeared, wearing khakis and a navy polo shirt, his backpack hanging from one shoulder. He paused briefly when he saw Nancy, gave a slight nod without meeting her eyes, then moved to the fridge to grab his lunch. The soft thud of the refrigerator door closing punctuated the awkward silence. Ready for school, honey? Denise asked, her voice warming considerably as she addressed her son. The transformation was immediate and striking, from ice to sunshine in a heartbeat. Yes, Mom. Caleb's voice was quiet but clear. He tucked his lunch into his backpack with practiced efficiency. Nancy set her coffee down, feeling awkward but wanting to help somehow. I could drive him if you need. The offer hung in the air, already feeling like a mistake before she'd finished speaking. That won't be necessary, Denise cut in smoothly, her tone brooking no argument. We have our routine. She gathered her keys and briefcase, then turned to Caleb. Let's go, sweetheart. Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, a gentle touch that spoke volumes about their connection. After they left, Nancy stood alone in the kitchen, the silence heavy around her. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud. Judge Lane appeared a few minutes later, carrying a stack of weathered cardboard boxes. Her steps were measured and deliberate, her eyes sharp and assessing. These need organizing, she said, setting them on the kitchen table. Legal files from civil rights cases in the 70s. They need to be scanned and properly labeled for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's archives. There was no question in her tone, just calm expectation. Nancy spent the morning surrounded by yellowed papers and faded photographs. Each document told a story: protest permits, court transcripts, handwritten testimonies of discrimination and courage. She found herself moving slower, reading snippets here and there, absorbing the weight of history in her hands. The musty smell of old paper filled her nostrils, a tangible connection to the past. One photo showed a much younger Judge Lane on the courthouse steps, standing tall despite the angry crowd around her. Another captured her speaking at a podium, her finger pointed firmly at someone off camera. The dates, the faces, the carefully preserved evidence of struggles fought decade after decade. It all made Nancy feel small and intrusive, like a trespasser in a sacred space. Her fingers trembled slightly as she handled each document. By afternoon, her fingers were dusty from the old papers, and her mind was full of other people's stories. She took a break, wandering into the den where she found Caleb watching what appeared to be a documentary about the Freedom Riders. The television's glow illuminated his face as he sat cross-legged on the couch, completely absorbed in the program. His eyes reflected the black and white footage, intent and thoughtful. Nancy hesitated, then quietly sat on the far end of the couch. Caleb didn't acknowledge her presence, but he didn't leave immediately either. On screen, elderly civil rights veterans recalled their experiences, their voices strong despite the years between then and now. The weight of their testimonies filled the room. For several minutes, they sat in shared silence, the only sound coming from the television. Nancy wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of the morning's historical documents still pressed on her chest, making words feel inadequate. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, unsure where to rest. Eventually, Caleb stood up without a word and left the room. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, leaving Nancy alone with the voices from the past still speaking through the screen. The cushion where he had sat still held his impression. That evening, Nancy sat at the small desk in her guest room, a blank journal open before her. She hadn't written in years, not since Eli. But something about this house, with its careful preservation of painful truths, made her pick up the pen. The lamplight cast a warm glow over the empty page, waiting for her thoughts. She wrote slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. "This house is heavy with stories. I'm afraid of mine." The words stared back at her from the page, raw and honest. Her handwriting looked unfamiliar after so long, slightly shaky but determined. Setting down her pen, Nancy turned to look out the window. The sky had darkened to deep purple, and crickets had begun their evening chorus. She listened to their steady chirping, wondering how many generations of crickets had sung outside these windows, accompanying all the stories these walls had witnessed. A distant porch light flickered on in a neighboring home. The room felt both too small and too large, a temporary shelter in a house built on foundations she was only beginning to understand. Through the open window, the evening air carried the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms, a gentle contrast to the weight of the day's revelations. She took a deep breath, letting the fragrance fill her lungs, momentarily soothing her troubled mind. The kitchen was quiet except for the scratch of pencil on paper and the occasional rustle of textbook pages. The overhead light cast a warm glow over the wooden table where Caleb sat, bent over his history worksheet. His brow furrowed in concentration as he tapped his eraser against the page, leaving tiny rubber shavings scattered across the paper. Nancy walked in, her footsteps hesitant on the tile floor. She headed toward the sink, trying to move quietly so as not to disturb him. As she filled her glass with water, she glanced over at his work. The worksheet was covered in crossed-out answers and eraser marks, evidence of his struggle with the assignment. She paused, glass in hand. "Are you having trouble with that?" Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, softer than she'd intended. Caleb looked up briefly, then back down at his paper. His shoulders tensed slightly. "It's fine." His tone was polite but distant, a careful wall between them. Nancy took a small step closer, keeping her distance but trying to see the worksheet. "Is that World War II history? I remember helping my—" She stopped herself, the words uncatching in her throat like a physical thing. "I used to be pretty good at history," she finished lamely, fingers tightening around her glass. Caleb's pencil stopped moving. He sat perfectly still for a long moment, as if weighing something heavy in his mind. Finally, he gave a slight nod, a tiny breach in his defenses. Nancy pulled out the chair across from him, movements slow and careful like approaching a nervous animal. "May I?" The question hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Another nod, barely perceptible. She settled into the chair and looked at the worksheet upside down. "The Battle of Midway," she read quietly. "That's a complicated one." Her finger hovered over the page without touching it, respecting the invisible boundary between them. "I keep mixing up the dates," Caleb admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And which ships were where?" The confession seemed to cost him something. Nancy pointed to a timeline at the bottom of the page. Sometimes it helps to work backward. Start with the outcome, then trace how they got there. She remembered using the same technique with Eli years ago, but pushed the memory away before it could show on her face. They fell into an awkward but functional rhythm. Nancy would offer quiet suggestions, and Caleb would either accept them with a nod or work through the problem on his own. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the gentle whir of the refrigerator and the shuffle of paper. Occasionally their eyes would meet, then quickly dart away. When Caleb started packing up his books, Nancy felt the shift in the air before he spoke. His movements became more deliberate, his silence heavier. The pencil went into his case with a snap, the textbook closed with a soft thud. "I'm not your son," he said finally, his voice steady and clear in the quiet kitchen. "I'm not your grief, I'm me. And you hit me." The words weren't angry, just stated as plain, undeniable facts. Nancy's hand trembled against the table. The truth of his words hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat felt tight, constricted by shame and regret. The kitchen seemed suddenly too bright, too exposed. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I know," she managed, her voice shaking. "I was wrong. There's no excuse." The words felt inadequate, pebbles thrown into an ocean of hurt. Caleb looked directly at her then, his gaze unwavering. In that moment, she saw not a child, but someone far wiser than his years. Someone who had already learned too much about the weight of other people's prejudices. His eyes held a dignity that made her want to look away. "Then say it," he challenged. "To my face." His chin lifted slightly, a small gesture of defiance and self-respect. Nancy straightened in her chair, forcing herself to meet his eyes. She owed him that much. "I'm sorry I hit you," she said, each word distinct and heavy with meaning. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't belong." Her voice cracked on the last word. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. His face showed no warmth, no forgiveness, but something shifted in his expression. A small acknowledgement of her words. He gave a single nod, then picked up his backpack and walked out of the kitchen without another word. The backpack straps made a soft swishing sound against his shirt as he left. Nancy remained at the table, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. The kitchen felt different now. Not exactly lighter, but clearer somehow. The refrigerator hummed its steady song. The clock ticked on the wall. And in that ordinary quiet, she sat with the weight of the first real truth she'd spoken since arriving, and the first time she'd truly meant it. She touched the spot on the table where Caleb's worksheet had been, tracing the ghost of their temporary truce with her fingertip. A few eraser shavings clung to her skin. The truth, once spoken, hung in the air like an invisible thread between what was and what could be. Not a mending, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of one. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the tile floor. Nancy shuffled in, still adjusting to the unfamiliar routine of this house. Her slippers made soft scraping sounds against the cool tiles as she moved. She stopped short when she saw Caleb at the table, methodically spooning cereal into his mouth while reading from a thick textbook propped against the milk carton. His eyes moved quickly across the pages, absorbing information with quiet intensity. "Good morning," he said quietly, not looking up from his book, a strand of dark hair falling across his forehead. Nancy blinked, caught off guard by his unprompted greeting. It was the first time he'd initiated any conversation. Good morning," she replied, her voice slightly uncertain, hovering between surprise and caution. Behind her newspaper at the far end of the table, Judge Lane sat perfectly still, though her eyes weren't moving across the page anymore. She was listening, watching, measuring the weight of this small exchange. The rustle of her paper had gone silent. Nancy moved carefully through the kitchen, hyper-aware of her movements as she prepared her coffee. The familiar ritual of measuring grounds and pouring water gave her something to focus on. The silence wasn't quite as heavy as it had been days before. Something had shifted ever so slightly, like the first thaw after a long winter. Later that afternoon, Nancy's phone buzzed with a text from Denise. "Need you to pick up Caleb from school. 3:15. Her heart rate quickened, a flutter of anxiety in her chest. She texted back a simple "okay" and spent the next hour wondering if this was a test, pacing the guest room and checking her watch repeatedly. The school parking lot was busy with parents and buses when Nancy pulled up in Judge Lane's borrowed car. Horns honked, and children called to one another across the asphalt. She spotted Caleb immediately, standing apart from the crowd, his backpack neat and his posture straight. Unlike the other slouching teenagers, he stood tall, as if carrying something precious. He slid into the passenger seat with a quiet, "Hello," the door closing with a solid thunk. They drove in silence for several minutes, the only sound the soft whoosh of passing cars and the tick of the turn signal. Nancy's hands were tight on the steering wheel, her knuckles nearly white. She glanced at Caleb, who was staring out the window, his reflection thoughtful in the glass. "Do you like music?" she asked finally, her voice breaking through the quiet, sounding too loud in the confined space. "I play piano," he answered, still looking out the window. "Classical." His fingers twitched slightly in his lap, as if finding phantom keys. Nancy reached for the radio, finding the classical station. The rich sounds of a piano concerto filled the car, delicate notes cascading like water. They both sat straighter, listening, drawn into the music's spell. After a moment, Caleb spoke. "It's Chopin." His voice carried a hint of appreciation, a small connection made. "You can play like this?" Nancy asked, genuine curiosity in her voice, her eyes briefly leaving the road to glance at him. "I try," he said with a small shrug, but there was a hint of pride in his voice. "My teacher says I have good expression." The music continued to flow around them, creating a buffer that made conversation somehow easier, a neutral territory they could both inhabit. Caleb shifted in his seat, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "My essay," he said suddenly, "the one that won the competition? It was about belonging." He paused, as if weighing whether to continue, his breath fogging the window slightly. "About all the times people told me I didn't fit. Sometimes they didn't even need to say it out loud." Nancy's hands tightened on the steering wheel again, but for a different reason now. A knot formed in her throat. She kept her eyes on the road, listening, afraid that any word from her might break this fragile moment. "In advanced classes, they'd ask if I was in the right room," he continued, his voice steady but quiet. "At piano recitals, people would look surprised when I walked on stage, like they couldn't believe I could play classical music, like Mozart and Bach weren't meant for me." Nancy didn't speak, didn't try to defend or explain or minimize. She just listened, letting his words fill the space between them, heavy with meaning she was only beginning to understand. "The essay was about finding your place anyway," he said. "About belonging because you decide to belong, not because others let you. About making your own space when no one offers you one." They turned onto Judge Lane's street, the familiar red brick house coming into view, solid and permanent against the afternoon sky. Nancy pulled into the driveway, putting the car in park. The classical music played on softly in the background, a gentle counterpoint to the weight of their conversation. Caleb gathered his backpack and opened the door. Before stepping out, he turned slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers briefly. "Thanks for the ride." Nancy felt the corner of her mouth lift in a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for the music." The words felt inadequate for what had just passed between them. She watched him walk to the front door, his backpack swaying slightly with each step, his shadow long in the afternoon light. The weight of his words settled around her like a heavy blanket, warming and suffocating all at once. In the quiet of the car, Chopin's notes continued to play, filling the space where words used to be, saying things neither of them could yet express. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the study's windows as Nancy wandered the quiet house. Judge Lane had left for a civic engagement downtown, leaving Nancy alone with her thoughts and the weight of history surrounding her. The study was small but dignified, with dark wood shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound law books and carefully preserved photographs. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a scent that somehow made the room feel even more important. Her fingers traced along the spines until they found a large album, its cover worn soft with age and handling. She carefully lifted it from its resting place and settled into a nearby armchair, the leather creaking softly beneath her. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams as she opened the cover with hesitant hands. The first page took her breath away. There was Judge Lane, decades younger, but with the same steady gaze, standing shoulder to shoulder with civil rights leaders at a march in Selma. The black and white photograph captured determination etched on every face. Nancy turned the page slowly, treating each image with reverence, aware that she was holding pieces of history that had shaped the world she lived in. More photos followed, Judge Lane being sworn in as a federal judge, her hand raised with quiet pride. Another showed her addressing a crowd from courthouse steps, her expression fierce and focused. Then came a particularly striking image, Judge Lane standing beside a teenage John Lewis, both of them radiating purpose and dignity. Nancy's hand trembled slightly as she touched the edge of the photo, feeling suddenly unworthy to even be handling such treasures. "This is what real courage looks like," she whispered to herself, the weight of her recent actions pressing heavily on her conscience. These people had faced water hoses and police dogs, while she couldn't even face her own prejudice. As she continued through the album, the photos began to shift from historical moments to more personal ones. Church gatherings, community celebrations, family picnics, all showing the intricate web of love and support that had nurtured generations. Faces beamed with joy at graduations, weddings, and Sunday dinners. And then, tucked near the back, she found them. Baby pictures of Caleb. Her heart caught in her throat. There he was, maybe 6 months old, laughing with his whole body while crawling across a colorful blanket. Another showed him taking his first wobbly steps, tiny hands reaching toward the camera with pure joy. In each photo, he was surrounded by love, held, supported, celebrated. His eyes, even then, held that same thoughtful awareness she'd seen on the plane. Nancy sat back, overwhelmed by emotion. These weren't just family snapshots. They were proof of something deeper. Each image was a thread in a tapestry of strength, resilience, and unwavering dignity. The same dignity she had tried to strip from Caleb on that plane. She felt a tear slide down her cheek before she even realized she was crying. The front door opened and closed downstairs. Nancy heard Judge Lane's measured footsteps in the hallway, the confident stride of someone who knew exactly who she was. "In here," Nancy called softly, her voice thick with emotion. Judge Lane appeared in the doorway, still wearing her event clothes, a tailored suit that spoke of authority and grace. Her eyes fell to the album in Nancy's lap, but she didn't seem surprised or angry. Instead, there was a quiet understanding in her gaze. "Do you think," Nancy began, then had to swallow hard before continuing, "do you think I could have ever raised a boy like him?" Judge Lane didn't answer immediately. She crossed the room and stood by the window, looking out at the garden where generations of her family had played and grown. The fading light caught the silver in her hair, making it shine like a crown. "I don't know," she finally said, turning back to Nancy. "Could you have protected him?" The question hit Nancy like a physical force. Not just protected from harm, she realized, but protected his spirit, his dignity, his right to take up space in the world. She thought of Caleb's face on the plane, composed even in the face of her cruelty, and understood suddenly that such strength came from years of careful nurturing. She started, but found she had no answer. Only more questions about who she might have been if life had taken different turns. Later that evening, the family gathered for dinner as usual. The formal dining room still felt intimidating to Nancy, but something had shifted. The silence as they passed dishes wasn't quite so sharp. Caleb asked for the salt, and Nancy handed it over without the usual tension crackling between them. Their fingers didn't touch, but the exchange felt like a tiny bridge being built. After dinner, Nancy returned to the study. She lifted the album one more time, taking in the faces that looked back at her, faces that had fought, persevered, and paved the way for children like Caleb to fly first class without apology, faces that had changed the world while she had only tried to make it smaller. With gentle hands, she closed the album and returned it to its place on the shelf. Her fingers lingered on its spine as the full weight of understanding settled over her. The bookshelf seemed to stand taller now, a guardian of memories that mattered. "He's not just a kid," she whispered into the quiet room. "He's their legacy." For the first time since arriving, she felt truly small and ready to learn how to grow. Perhaps that was the beginning of wisdom. Nancy's phone buzzed against the nightstand, pulling her from a fitful sleep. She squinted at the bright screen in the dim morning light, her heart stopping as notifications flooded in. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages. But it was the headline that made her blood run cold. "Flight attendant slaps black child in first class. Leaked video sparks outrage." Her hands trembled as she opened the video. There she was, her face twisted with anger, striking Caleb across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through her phone's speakers, making her flinch. The camera caught everything, her accusations, his politeness, Judge Lane's arrival. The comments below were brutal, calling for her head, her job, her future. "No, no, no," she whispered, scrolling frantically through message after message. Her airline crew group chat was exploding with gossip. Former colleagues were distancing themselves. Friends were sending concerned texts asking if it was really her in the video. A commotion outside drew her to the window. Her stomach dropped at the sight of news vans pulling up to the curb, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky. Reporters clutched microphones and cameras, while a small group of protesters began gathering at the edge of the lawn. Their signs were clear even from her second-floor window. "Racism has no place in the skies," and "Justice for Caleb." Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email from the airline's HR department. The subject line said everything: "Termination of employment, effective immediately." She read it through tears. No phone call, no chance to explain, just cold corporate language about violation of company policies and damage to brand reputation. 20 years of service ended in 3 paragraphs. The house came alive with activity. She heard Judge Lane's phone ringing constantly, the judge's measured voice responding to what must have been journalists and civil rights leaders. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps hurried past her room. Nancy changed quickly and ventured downstairs, desperate to explain herself to someone. Anyone. She found Denise in the kitchen, gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles were white. "Denise, please," Nancy started, her voice cracking. "I need to—" "You need to what?" Denise cut her off, her voice arctic cold. "Explain? Defend yourself? You had your chance to speak. Now the world will—" She set down her mug with deliberate care. "My son is trending on Twitter because you couldn't control your prejudice. Your explanation means nothing now." Nancy's legs gave out and she sank into a kitchen chair. "I was trying to change," she whispered. "I was learning." "Learning?" Denise laughed without humor. "You were here for 5 days. Did you think that would erase what you did? That living in a black family's home would magically cure your racism?" The sound of a door closing made them both turn. Caleb stood in the doorway, backpack in hand. When he saw Nancy, his face went blank, and he turned around without a word, disappearing back upstairs. Nancy's chest felt too tight. She couldn't breathe. The room started spinning as panic clawed at her throat. She stumbled back to her guest room, barely making it inside before her legs gave out completely. She slid down the wall to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees as sobs racked her body. "I tried," she whispered to the empty room, "and it wasn't enough." From the hallway, Judge Lane's voice carried through the door, steady and clear. "Redemption isn't proven by applause. It's proven by what you do when no one's clapping." The house had fallen quiet as evening settled in, the protesters and news vans finally dispersing as darkness crept across the lawn. Nancy hadn't moved from her spot on the floor since morning, her back pressed against the cool wall, knees pulled tight to her chest. The only light in her room came from her phone screen, casting harsh shadows as it continued its relentless dance of notifications. Another angry comment popped up. She should never work again. Nancy's thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. She couldn't stop reading them, each new message driving the knife deeper. Her mother had called 14 times now. What could she even say? How could she explain this to Tyler? The soft knock at her door made her jump. She quickly wiped her face with her sleeve, though it hardly mattered. She knew she looked terrible. She hadn't eaten all day, hadn't changed clothes, hadn't done anything but spiral deeper into her shame. "Come in," she managed, her voice scratchy from crying. The door opened slowly, and Denise Johnson stood in the doorway, her silhouette elegant even in this moment of tension. She held a glass of water, condensation beading on its surface. Her face was carefully neutral as she regarded Nancy on the floor. Nancy tried to straighten up to salvage some dignity, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She remained curled up, small and broken on the hardwood floor. Denise stepped into the room, her heels making soft clicks against the wood. "I tried," Nancy whispered, her voice cracking. "I told the truth. I meant every word." She gestured weakly at her phone, still lighting up with hatred, and none of it mattered. Denise moved closer, her movements measured and deliberate. She knelt beside Nancy, not offering comfort, but simply being present. Her proximity wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. She was there to witness, nothing more. "I know I was wrong," Nancy continued, the words spilling out now. "But now I'm just hated." Her voice broke on the last word, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Denise was quiet for a long moment, her breath steady in the dim room. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "Welcome to what it feels like, when the world decides your whole worth based on one moment." The words hit Nancy like a physical blow. She looked up at Denise, really looked at her, and saw centuries of understanding in her eyes. This wasn't just about Nancy's current situation. It was about something much deeper, much older, much more profound. A shadow moved in the doorway and Judge Lane appeared, her presence filling the room without a word. She stood there, watching the scene before her, her face illuminated by the soft hallway light. "Redemption isn't proven by applause," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom. "It's proven by what you do when no one's clapping." She moved forward just enough to place the glass of water on the nightstand, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading down the hall. Denise remained for a moment longer, her gaze steady on Nancy, before she too stood and left, closing the door softly behind her. Nancy stayed on the floor, but something had shifted inside her. The tears still came, but they felt different now. Her phone continued to buzz, but the sound seemed more distant. She reached up and took the glass of water, drinking slowly, feeling the cool liquid soothe her raw throat. Later, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from passing cars dance across it. For the first time since the video had leaked, she wasn't crying out of guilt or shame or fear. These tears came from somewhere deeper, from acceptance, from understanding, from the first real glimpse of what true accountability might look like. "I'll show up," she whispered to the darkness, her voice steady despite its softness, "even if no one's watching." The words hung in the air, not a promise or a plea, but a simple statement of truth. Outside, crickets chirped their endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Nancy closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the house wash over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new headlines, new judgment. But for now, in this moment, she had found something solid to stand on, even if she was the only one who knew it. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting warm patterns across the hardwood floors. The morning felt different somehow, lighter, as if the weight of yesterday's media storm had finally lifted. Judge Lane sat at the kitchen table, methodically sorting through the morning mail, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. A cream-colored envelope caught her attention. She opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside. Her eyes scanned the contents before she called out, "Caleb, come here a moment, baby." Caleb appeared in the doorway, still in his Sunday morning clothes, pressed khakis and a light blue button-down. He'd been quieter since yesterday, more withdrawn, but his posture remained straight and dignified. "There's an invitation here," Judge Lane said, holding up the letter. The Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School is hosting their annual youth literacy event next week. They'd like you to be their keynote speaker, to read your essay, Belonging. Caleb stepped forward, taking the letter in his hands. His eyes moved across the words slowly, deliberately. After a moment, he nodded silently. But there was a flicker of pride in his eyes that hadn't been there in days. Nancy stood in the hallway halfway between entering and retreating. She'd been doing that a lot lately, hovering on the edges of rooms, unsure of her place in this delicate ecosystem. Judge Lane noticed her hesitation and turned in her chair. "You don't have to hide anymore," Judge Lane said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You can stand beside the truth, even if it still hurts." Nancy wrapped her arms around herself, uncertainty written across her face. I'm not sure if I should." Caleb looked up from the letter, his eyes meeting Nancy's for the first time that morning. There was something different in his gaze. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps understanding. "You can come," he said quietly, then added with wisdom beyond his years, "But don't say anything unless you're ready to mean it." The words hung in the air between them. Nancy nodded, swallowing hard. "I'd like to help," she offered softly, "if you want it." They settled at the dining room table, spreading out Caleb's essay notes. Nancy sat at a respectful distance, but close enough to see the careful handwriting, the thoughtful revisions. They worked in comfortable silence at first, broken only by the occasional suggestion or question. "Maybe we could make this transition smoother," Nancy ventured, pointing to a paragraph. Caleb considered it, then made a small mark with his pencil. As the afternoon light shifted through the windows, their interactions grew more natural. Caleb would sometimes read a section aloud, testing the rhythm of his words. Nancy listened intently, offering gentle feedback when asked. There was still caution in their exchange, but the sharp edge of hurt had begun to soften. From the hallway, Denise watched the scene unfold. Her arms were crossed, but her expression had shifted from its usual protective wariness to something more contemplative. She observed how her son's shoulders had relaxed slightly, how he didn't flinch when Nancy reached for a paper near his hand. "This part," Caleb said, tapping his pencil on a particular passage, "I want it to be stronger." Nancy leaned in slightly, reading the words. "What if you started with why it matters, before you tell them what happened?" Caleb considered this, then began rewriting. The scratch of his pencil filled the quiet room. As evening approached, Nancy excused herself to prepare for the upcoming event. In her guest room, she stood before the mirror, carefully ironing her white blouse. Her hands trembled as she pressed each sleeve, each collar point. But this time, the trembling came from something different than fear or shame. It came from the weight of trying to make things right, of taking small steps toward redemption. She whispered to her reflection, her voice barely audible. "Let this be enough. Please, let it be enough." The iron hissed softly as she smoothed another wrinkle, each motion deliberate and careful, like the fragile new understanding beginning to form between her and Caleb. Outside her window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in gentle shades of pink and gold. Another day was ending in the Lane household, not with the dramatic tension of yesterday, but with the quiet possibility of tomorrow. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp spring breeze. The auditorium at Jefferson Middle School hummed with anticipation as parents, teachers, and local press filled the rows of seats. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a colorful banner that stretched across the stage. Voices of the Future, Youth Literacy Day. Backstage, Caleb Johnson adjusted his navy blazer in a small mirror, his hands steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. The essay he'd written felt heavier now than when he'd first penned it, weighted with new meaning after everything that had happened. In the front row, Nancy Whitaker sat rigidly between Judge Lane and Denise, trying to make herself as small as possible. She could feel the occasional glances from other attendees who recognized her from the viral video. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her modest black dress. The principal stepped up to the podium, welcoming everyone and introducing the day's young speakers. Nancy barely heard the words, lost in her own thoughts until Caleb's name was announced. The audience applauded as Caleb walked onto the stage, his footsteps echoing in the hushed auditorium. He approached the podium with quiet dignity, adjusted the microphone, and unfolded his essay. Taking a deep breath, he began to read. "Belonging isn't just about finding your place," his voice rang out, clear and strong. "It's about claiming it, even when others try to tell you that you don't deserve to be there." As Caleb continued, his words painted vivid pictures of moments when he'd been underestimated, judged, or made to feel less than. He spoke about walking into rooms where people's eyes followed him with suspicion, about raising his hand in advanced classes where he was the only black student, about learning to stand tall when others tried to make him shrink. Nancy felt each word like a physical weight on her chest. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to listen, really listen, to every word. Then Caleb paused, looking up from his paper. The unexpected silence drew everyone's attention. His next words weren't part of the written essay. "There was a moment this year where I felt like I didn't belong anywhere, even though I'd earned my seat," he said, his voice softer but no less powerful. "But I also learned that people can change, if they really want to." His eyes found Nancy in the front row. She felt her heart stop. "I want to invite someone up here," Caleb continued. "She didn't plan this, but I think she has something to say." The audience murmured in confusion as Nancy slowly stood, her legs trembling. Judge Lane touched her arm gently as she passed. The walk to the stage felt endless. Standing beside Caleb at the podium, Nancy gripped the edges until her knuckles turned white. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some recognizing her with widening eyes. Her throat felt dry. "My name is Nancy Whitaker," she began, her voice shaking, "and 2 weeks ago I did something unforgivable." The words started pouring out, raw, unscripted, and honest. She told them about that day on the plane, about her assumptions and prejudices, about striking a child who had done nothing wrong. She spoke about losing her son Eli to an overdose, about how grief had twisted into something ugly inside her, about how she'd projected that pain onto an innocent boy who only wanted to claim his rightfully earned seat. "The second worst day of my life was when I lost my son," she said, tears now flowing freely. "But the worst was the day I made your son feel like he didn't belong. If you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making it right." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Nancy could hear her own heart pounding. Then, somewhere in the back, someone began to clap. The sound spread slowly at first, then built into a wave. People began to stand. First a few, then dozens, then the entire audience. Through her tears, Nancy saw Judge Lane and Denise standing too. Denise's face remained composed, but there was something softer in her eyes now. Judge Lane nodded once, a slight smile on her lips. When the applause finally died down, Nancy and Caleb made their way backstage. They sat side by side on a bench in the quiet darkness, neither speaking for several long moments. The sounds of the continuing program drifted through the curtain. Finally, Caleb glanced at her and said simply, "It was enough." Nancy didn't respond. She didn't need to. She just let the tears fall, feeling for the first time that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Nancy Whitaker walked beside Caleb Johnson, their rolling bags making a synchronized rhythm against the tiles. The bustling terminal felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of their shared history had transformed into something unexpectedly beautiful. Caleb wore a crisp button-down shirt and khakis, looking every bit the poised young speaker he'd become. At 14 now, he carried himself with even more confidence than before, though his gentle nature remained unchanged. Nancy had traded her flight attendant uniform for a simple blazer and slacks, her face softer and more open than it had been 6 months ago. They approached Gate C-12, where travelers were already lining up for early boarding. Nancy reached into her bag and pulled out 2 first-class boarding passes, handing one to Caleb with a warm smile. "You didn't have to sit with me," Caleb said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Nancy's response came easily, naturally. "I want to." The gate agent scanned their tickets and they made their way down the jet bridge together. Other passengers streamed around them, some doing double takes as recognition flickered across their faces. The viral video had faded from headlines months ago, but its ghost still lingered in certain spaces. As they stepped onto the plane, Nancy felt none of the defensive tension that had once driven her actions. Instead, she moved with quiet purpose, helping Caleb store his carry-on in the overhead bin before they settled into seats 3A and 3B. A young white girl, perhaps 7 or 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve across the aisle. "Isn't that the woman who hit that boy?" she whispered, loud enough to carry. Her mother looked up from her phone, studied Nancy and Caleb for a moment, then leaned down to respond softly. Maybe she was. But now, she's something else. Nancy didn't flinch at the exchange. She'd learned to carry both versions of herself, the woman who'd made that terrible mistake, and the one who'd chosen to grow from it. Caleb glanced at her, offering a small nod of understanding. From row 5D, Judge Lane looked up from her book, her gray scarf draped elegantly around her shoulders. She caught Nancy's eye and gave the smallest of smiles. Not one of approval or forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. They'd all come so far from that first terrible day. The cabin filled with the usual pre-flight sounds, overhead bins clicking shut, safety announcements, the low hum of conversation. But for Nancy and Caleb, it was different now. They weren't adversaries or even reluctant companions. They were friends, bound by something deeper than guilt or obligation. Caleb pulled out his speech notes for the youth summit in D.C., and Nancy leaned over to look. This wasn't the first time she'd helped him prepare for a presentation. Over the months, they'd developed a rhythm. He'd practice, she'd listen, and together they'd refine his message about belonging and transformation. "Want to run through it one more time?" Nancy asked, her voice carrying none of the condescension that had once colored her words. "Maybe after takeoff," Caleb replied, settling back in his seat. "Right now, I just want to enjoy this." Nancy understood exactly what he meant. Every flight they took together was a quiet victory, a reminder of how far they'd come from that first devastating encounter. She wasn't here as his guardian or supervisor. She was here because they'd both chosen to transform their worst moment into something meaningful. The plane began to taxi, and Nancy gazed out the window. The morning sun caught the wing, making it gleam like a promise. She thought about the memoir she'd been writing, about second chances and the courage it takes to accept them, about how sometimes the people we hurt the most become the ones who teach us the most about healing. "You don't erase the past," she'd written in her journal just that morning. "But sometimes, if you're lucky, you meet someone brave enough to hand you a second chance, and kind enough to sit beside you while you learn how to take it." The engines roared to life and the plane lifted smoothly into the air. Beside her, Caleb was already absorbed in his notes, preparing to share their story with a new audience. Nancy watched Atlanta grow smaller below them, knowing that while some might still see them as characters in a viral video, the truth was far more profound. They had become living proof that redemption wasn't just about making amends, it was about becoming someone new while honoring the journey that brought you there. If you enjoyed the story of Caleb, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.